Hi. I have been going through the Bearing Thorough Witness book, looking at their coverage of the book of Acts. Right now we're in Acts 9, verses 18 to 30. That's the reading that they're going to cover. During the last days when I was a Jehovah's Witness, David had recommended that when I went to the meetings to study the material better than I had before, looking up the text and reading them and reading the surrounding verses. So this is a good example of how you can do that. The subtitle on page 63 is He Began to Preach Jesus. And they have in brackets Acts 9, 18 to 30. Frequently within paragraphs, they're just citing a reference to one or two verses. But in this case, they're saying they're covering all those verses. So what I would have done if I was back then and studying this book would be to read Acts 9, 18 to 30. So that's what we'll do initially. Read the text, get an idea of what it's about and what you would take from it. And then we can look at what the Watchtower spin on the same material is. Is it what you would gain from it? Acts 9, verses 18 to 30, and I'm reading it from the Silver Sword, the big edition, study edition. And immediately what looked like scales fell from his eyes, and he recovered his sight. He then got up and was baptized, and he ate some food and gained strength. He stayed for some days with the disciples in Damascus, and immediately in the synagogues he began to preach about Jesus, that this one is the Son of God. But all those hearing him were astonished, and were saying, Is this not the man who ravaged those in Jerusalem, who called on this name? Did he not come here for the purpose of arresting them and taking them to the chief priests? But Saul kept on acquiring more and more power, and was confounding the Jews who lived in Damascus, as he proved logically that this is the Christ. Now when many days had passed, the Jews plotted together to do away with him. However, their plot against Saul became known to him. They were also watching the gates closely, both day and night, in order to do away with him. So his disciples took him and let him down by night through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. On arriving in Jerusalem, he made efforts to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, because they did not believe he was a disciple. So Barnabas came to his aid, and led him to the apostles, and he told them in detail how on the road he had seen the Lord, and that he had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had spoken boldly in the name of Jesus. So he remained with them, moving about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. He was talking and disputing with the Greek-speaking Jews, but these made attempts to do away with him. When the brothers found out about this, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. All right, so what would we gain from our reading of this text? I would say the first thing I would observe is how quickly he's baptized. He is baptized that day. The scales fall from his eyes. He's had a conversation with the Lord. And he's blind for 3 days. He gets healed. Ananias visits him, and he gets baptized. no Bible study, no joining an organization. He's just had a conversation with Jesus and with Ananias, and he's baptized. So that's in direct contrast to the way we would do things as witnesses. Where is he preaching? We're told that he is in Jerusalem. He's talking to people who are surprised. He's in Damascus. They're surprised that this is the guy that had come, and he was going to arrest people who called on the name of the Lord. So the name that he has just finished talking about would be Jesus. Jesus was the one who he preaches about. It says Jesus, that this one is the Son of God. And then the people say, is this not the man who ravaged those in Jerusalem who call on this name? So you know that he's talking about Jesus. There's one verse in the Silver Sword edition that I did want to comment on. Verse 22, if you have a kingdom interlinear, when you're reading New Testament texts anyways, it's a good idea to check out the interlinear and see what the text, actually the wording is. Because this word seemed odd to me when I was reading it recently. Proved logically that this is the Christ. I didn't remember ever reading that in any other text. And that's because the word logic is a Greek word, but it's not used in this text. And if you check the interlinear, you'll see that they've just put this in there. I think reading the material from the Bearing book is going to bear some light on why they would want to put that word in the text. So how does he confound the Jews that he's speaking to? And he's speaking in the synagogue. It says that he's going to the synagogues. And he's confounding them, proving to them that this one is the Christ. So how does he prove it to them? It's not through logic. It's through the Old Testament that they're reading, that they're using. He proves to them from their own prophecies about the Messiah that Jesus is that one. So here too, I think it's important to note that it often uses the expression the Jews. When I was a witness, it was always Christians and the Jews. And so you had this negative feeling about the Jews, and you never differentiated between the Jewish Christians and the Jews that were opposing Christianity, that were opposing the message of the apostles. I think that should be noted. So the Jews that are plotting to get rid of Paul are his opponents, and they are from the synagogue. Later in what we read, it said the Greek-speaking Jews. Again, he is speaking when Barnabas testifies to the apostles in Jerusalem about Paul, because everybody's a little nervous of Paul, knowing his reputation. He says that he had seen the Lord, that he was speaking boldly about Jesus, and speaking in the name of the Lord. That would be Jesus then, in that reference. So you'll note that in what I read, there was no Jehovah in this text. The context made it absolutely impossible for them to change any of the Lords here into Jehovah. Okay, so those are things that I would have noted in reading it on my own. Now let's just have a brief look at a couple of paragraphs in the Bearing book, and then we'll do some more the next time. Initially, this is what the Watchtower says. After he was healed, he submitted to baptism and began associating closely with the disciples in Damascus. So what I would note is in this text, you only hear about him being with them some days. So I think it's kind of overstating this a little. And his submitting to baptism, it's an immediate thing. They don't make any mention of the fact of how quickly he's baptized and how there isn't any in-between stage of a Bible study and attending meetings and doing all the things that we do as witnesses. But they try in the very next paragraph to get your mind to shift there by saying, if you are studying the Bible but are not yet baptized, will you be like Saul and act decisively on what you learn? So they want you to think you're to be like Paul and immediately go around preaching. They mention, if you respond similarly to Paul, you will let nothing stop you from joining in the preaching work and becoming qualified for baptism. But we already know that Saul was baptized immediately. He didn't do his preaching before he was baptized or before he had the conversation with Christ, where Christ says that he is to be a chosen vessel for him. This is not said of everyone, so they don't make anything of the fact that he was assigned. It was God's purpose that he be preaching. He was going to be an apostle. But they slant it so that you think that's your job as well, to do the preaching work. They say, can you picture the surprise and shock and anger that must have rippled through the crowds when Saul began to preach about Jesus in the synagogues? Is this not the man that ravaged those in Jerusalem who call upon this name? So they're right. He's talking in the synagogues about Jesus, about his name. And then it says, what explained his change of heart about Jesus? Saul proved logically that this is the Christ. They quote from their translation. But logic is not a universal key. It cannot unlock every mind shackled by tradition or every heart bound by pride. Still, Paul did not give up. So again, I would just say he wasn't using logic, but we were trained to think that we had to reason things out and that this would convince and prove the truth of things. But he uses the Old Testament to prove what he's saying is true. So in the translations that I looked at, all it says is things like proving, demonstrating, this man, this Jesus is the Messiah or the Christ. All the other translations I looked at, and I looked at more than a dozen translations. Okay, so the next time we'll look a little more at some of the texts that they cite. I'm going to link to, did we notice as Jehovah's Witnesses that Paul constantly visited synagogues and views the Jews as his brothers? And I'll also put the playlist for Acts on the end here. Thanks.